Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about the wreck of the Northumberland, which is emerging from the ship Swallower. So I should probably explain, what do I mean by the ship Swallower? It is, of course, the famous Goodwin Sands, which is located off the east coast of Kent, and it extends roughly from Ramsgate in the north and down towards Dover in the south. And it's a series of sandbanks that are constantly moving and shifting. It's located near a very busy, highway, sea highway. And this has been a hazard to watercraft since seafaring began. So there's thousands upon thousands of shipwrecks on the Goodwin Sands, and it's also known as a graveyard for shipwrecks. And it has this amazing ability to just engulf ships and preserve them for hundreds of years. Now, at low water, you can see the sands, and like an iceberg, what you see is just the very top. They extend much further beneath the surface. And when a shipwreck or when a ship hits the sands, over time they will gradually sink to the bottom until they hit the bedrock. And during that time of burial, they're encapsulated, they're preserved in the anaerobic environment. But these sands move and they shift. And as one shipwreck becomes engulfed, another one emerges. And here are just some examples that we've recorded recently in the last few years with my friend and colleague Mark James from MSDS Marine. We've been conducting geophysical surveys, and you can just see the variety of wrecks on the Goodwins. And it's not just ships. You find Second World War German planes, and the fragile nature of the aluminium fuselage would not survive for 70 years or so if it hadn't been buried for much of that time. We also have Second World War mini subs known as the Sea Hunt. And these two sites were, the positions were given to us by Bob Peacock so we could survey them. But there's lots, there's thousands of wooden shipwrecks. Most of them are unidentified, as you can see from the other two images here. Now, a shipwreck will go through several cycles of burial and exposure. And when it's exposed, it's vulnerable to the physical and biological environment. So each time it's exposed, it's going to deteriorate a little bit or a lot. So it's extremely important to try and record as much as you can while you have that opportunity when it's exposed. And that's what I've been trying to do with the wreck of the Northumberland. So let me start talking about the Northumberland. Now, it all begins in 1677 when Parliament agree a shipbuilding programme, which is the largest shipbuilding programme of the late 17th century. It's 30 warships. 20 of those are third rates, which the Northumberland is one, 9 are second rates, and 1 is a first rate. And the masterminds behind this was Samuel Pepys, who was Secretary of the Admiralty at the time, and he was heavily supported by Charles II. Now, what was the need for this ambitious shipbuilding programme? Well, we just finished the Third Dutch War. The Navy was in a poor state. It needed improving. It needed new ships. Pepys also realised we had to improve the Navy. We had to make it more efficient and effective fighting machine. So he set up creating a standard, and that standard in the construction of the ship, but also in the manufacture and supply of guns and equipment. Also, he wanted to improve how the Navy was led and commanded. So he wanted to create a professional Navy by having properly trained officers. So the Northumberland is born during a very significant period in the development of the Royal Navy. Now, it was a very ambitious building program, and they wanted to make these ships, construct these ships and get them out quickly. But there wasn't enough space in the royal dockyards to do that. So they had to contract outside building contractors to build some of these ships. And one of those was the Northumberland, who the ship was built at Bristol at Bailey's yard. And Bailey had a good CV of building warships in the past, as well as merchant ships. The Northumberland was launched in 1679, so within 2 years, and she was a 70-gun third rate. Now, despite this, this need to produce these ships quickly, when they were launched, there was no wars going on. There was nothing for them to do. So they spent the first few years laid up in ordinary. So they're at anchor and pretty much slowly rotting away. And many of these ships, including the Northumberlands, had to have some major repairs. Now, it's important we understand the sort of constructional sequences in these repairs, because it will affect how we should interpret the archaeological remains on the seabed today. So the ship that we find, or the remains of the ship that we find, not necessarily the same as when it was launched in 1679. And these are some of the Van der Velde sketches of the 30 ships. There isn't a name one for the Northumberland. These are two unidentified ones, which could represent, could be the Northumberland, but the Northumberland would have looked very similar to these illustrations. Now, I said she was a 70-gun third rate, but she didn't necessarily carry 70 guns all of the time. During this kind of armament establishment, there were certain scenarios or operations when the ship would carry just 62. And for example, when she's fighting abroad during wartime, she would only have 62 guns. And the reason for this is they don't want to overweight the ship, especially when abroad, when you're carrying extra ammunition, you're carrying extra provisions, you're carrying extra stores. Pepys wanted to create a standard armament for the different types of ships. So a third rate all the third rates were meant to carry the same guns. Unfortunately, supply couldn't keep up with the demand. So what we find is on the Northumberland, for example, we know this from the Ordnance Survey from 1696, that rather than having 12-pounders on the upper deck, she was armed with the older demi-culverins. We also see that the main gun deck has 4 culverins instead of a full deck of demi-cannons. So there basically isn't enough guns to supply these ships with all of the same guns. The establishment. The Northumberland took part in some of the most famous battles of the late 17th century, and that includes the Battle of Beachy Head in 1690. And some of you may have dived on one of those wrecks from that battle at Norman's Bay with Mark Beattie. And that's a great site with 50 guns lying in very shallow water, and that's probably a Dutch ship. 2 years later, the English had their revenge against the French at the Battle of Barfleur. This is the Trafalgar of the Restoration Navy. And Northumberland also had some famous captains. Captain Benbow led the second bombardment at Saint-Malo from the Northumberland. Now, by the end of the century, the Northumberland was again in a bit of a poor state, along with many of the other ships, and it needed some major repairs. And she was taken to Chatham, and actually it was a rebuild. And it's likely that she was probably almost a totally new ship when she came out in 1702 and went back to sea. By 1703, which ended up being her last sort of operation, she was with the Mediterranean fleet, blockading the French at Toulon. Now, this campaign in the Mediterranean was a really long one. By the time they came back and they were traveling back to England, 1,500 men had been lost due to sickness and illness, probably scurvy, dysentery. The ones that were still alive were in a poor state. When they arrived back in England in the late autumn, it was only going to get worse. So this moves me on to the wrecking. The fleet arrived in the Downs, and they were taking shelter there. The Downs is located between the Goodwin Sands to the east and the coast to the west. The Northumberland was at anchor with several other Navy ships, and on the 26th of November 1703, they were hit by the greatest storm in recorded history. And there was hurricane force winds blowing from the direction west-southwest to southwest. This led to many of these ships dragging their anchors, and some of them even parting. And the tide was also working against them, moving to the north. So wind and tide drove these ships, or drove some of these ships, onto the Goodwin Sands, onto the west side of the Goodwin Sands. And that included the Northumberland, the Restoration, Stirling Castle, and the Mary. And they wrecked with a horrendous loss of life. All hands were lost on the Northumberland, the Restoration. There was one survivor from the Mary and about 70 survivors from the Stirling Castle. Now, these ships would have disappeared very quickly. The Stirling Castle remained above water a little longer than the other three, but once the Stirling had disappeared, they were pretty much forgotten for the next 300 years, until they were discovered. Firstly, the Stirling Castle in 1979, and they were discovered by a local group of divers, the Underwater Research Group of the Isle of Thanet, and they initially found the Stirling in 1979, and then quickly, soon after, the Northumberland, and then Restoration / Mary in 1980. I say / Mary because the Restoration Mary is not entirely, no one's entirely sure yet which one is which. Now, these sites were protected in 1981. How do we know that which site is which? Well, in terms of the Northumberland, bell was recovered with the date 1701 on, and that suggests this was one of the warships that had a major refit at the beginning of the century. The artifact that identifies the Northumberland, and some would say it's still rather tenuous, is a silver plate with the initials of the captain, James Greenway. Now, the initial here says IG. Apparently, J's were written as I's in those days. So at the moment, this is the Northumberland until proven otherwise. So let me just give you a brief background into the site history. The main investigator, the primary investigator, was Robert Peacock, and he became the licensee in 1993. Now, his work was assisted by the heritage agencies, which later would become English Heritage. Diving contractors initially were the Archaeological Diving Unit, and then later Wessex Archaeology. They all did several site inspections and also geophysical surveys. And alongside Bob, identified a site that was roughly 50 meters in length, 20 meters wide, and had a depth from the top of the wreck to the bottom of about 4 meters. Bob thinks the stern of the vessel is in the northwest end and the bow towards the southeast. And he's discovered over a period of 20 years that there was up to 17 guns, mainly on one side of the wreck, on the northern side. He found coherent structure on the western side extending below the wreck mound. At the southeastern end, he found an amazing area of rope, all different sizes, all coiled up on an amazingly well-preserved deck. So this is all suggesting that there's intact areas of the ship, at least from the orlop deck, surviving there. And in the middle of the site, we've got this huge concretion, which is made up of all sorts of different materials and objects, and I'll show you that in due course. In 2008, Bob invites me to dive the site, and I'm there to try and help him record the site in more detail for his master's dissertation. And we start recording the structure that's on the western side of the site, and we identify what we think is the lower part of the ship, with parts of the keel and the floor timbers and futtocks. We also find some other structural features, such as this chock which joins the ends of frames. We also find quite a significant artifact, which is a chain pump. And in 2011, we we want to do some excavation to try and do something a little more, and English Heritage grant this. But just as we're about to start work, the Goodwin Sands engulfs the wreck, and it completely stops diving. You could almost run, according to Bob, you would run your boat aground on the site. So there's no chance of any more work. So what do we do in the time while it's buried? Well, we decide to consolidate the work that has been done, and we publish, first of all, well, we publish 2 articles at the same time, an interim report, followed up by a specialist report on the chamber pump. And we did this with other colleagues from Historic England and the University of Southampton. And these are now open access. These articles are open access for 1 month. So between 2011 and 2015, the site is still buried. And unfortunately, Bob gives up diving and he sells his boat, which is extremely unfortunate because now there's no longer a constant presence on the Goodwins, monitoring the Northumberland and just generally keeping an eye on other sites of archaeological interest. So I then take on the responsibility of the licensee of the Northumberland in 2015. In 2016, I'm diving on another protected site on the Goodwins, which is the Rosevike, and I take the opportunity to ask the skipper if he could pass over the site so we can look on the echo sounder to see if there's any part of the wreck showing. And to my surprise and happiness, there we see a little blip on the seabed suggesting that this part of the site is suddenly is exposed again. So with this fantastic news, I contact Historic England, and between us we carry out a they fund me to do a multi-beam survey. And so I contact Mark James and MSS Marine, and we go out onto the Goodwins with Swave Services, and we carry out a multi-beam survey. This is great for producing a rapid record of the site to understand the extent of the archaeological remains that are exposed. And we can see that it's not as exposed as it was in 2005, but there's about a length of 40 meters of exposed wreck material there. But one survey doesn't tell us whether this site is under any threats. We want to know which direction the sand is moving. Is it moving in a way that's going to uncover the site even more, or is it going to bury the site? So Historic England fund us again to conduct another multi-beam survey. We're also out there monitoring all the other designated sites as well. So in 2018, we're out again, and we do find that the sand looks like it's migrating away from the wreck. So we start diving the site to see if we can identify the exposed archaeological remains, and also to see what type of condition it is in. We also, while we're diving the site, we notice it's covered in fishing net. And this is a hazard to diving, it's a hazard to the archaeology, and it's a hazard to the marine life. But we still really don't understand what the extent of the Northumberland is below the surface, and what we would be dealing with if the site should really uncover. We've also never really seen a great deal of guns. We've only seen up to about 17 guns on site, and this should be a site that has either 62 or 70 guns. So where are these? Are they within the wreck mound, or are they somewhere else? We've got the restoration, which lies 400 meters to the north. Is there a debris trail between those two wrecks, and what can it tell us about the wrecking processes of these two wrecks? So Historic England in 2020 funded me to go out and do another multi-beam survey, followed by sub-bottom, to identify the depth of stratigraphy, and also magnetometer surveys. So the multi-beam surveys records the exposed, what's exposed on the seabed. And it's the best way to monitor sites in the Goodwin Sands, because on the Goodwins, the sands are so dynamic, you get meter to decameter movement of sand. Putting in sediment monitoring poles is a complete waste of time. And there's nothing to bed into unless you're on the bedrock. And the sand moves so much that these sediment poles would merely just fall over. And you can see from these series of multi-beams just how much the sand has migrated away from both the Restoration and the Northumberland. The Restoration here lies to the north and the Northumberland to the south. And you can see by 2020, the sandbank has moved to the northeast, completely exposing the Restoration, which you can see is actually this, it's in two, you know, at least in two parts with a debris trail. And the Northumberland lies on the very edge of a sub-Aquarius dune. These sub-Aquarius dunes are formed basically as the main sandbank has moved away. The sand along the edge of that thins out, and it forms these sort of Christmas tree branches. And the Northumberland is right on the edge of one of those. And actually now I think that has passed right over the site. This is what the site looked like in November 2020, and you can see which way the sands are going on the wreck mound. You can see these kind of like plumes, look like plumes of smoke. And that's how the sand is being not slowly, it's being rapidly blown off the wreck mound. And you can also see how you've got the edge of that sub-Aquarius dune. You've got the deepest seabed, which is the purple area, and the dune, which is the blue area. The site doesn't look like anything like this now when we went back to diving in 2021, which demonstrates to us that this sand dune has moved on now. This is the results of the magnetometer survey. So I wanted to survey the sites together so we could understand the relationship between the two sites. Now, if the Restoration is the Restoration, it should have a very similar magnetic strength to the Northumberland. They're both 70-gun warships, but you can see that they're very different. The Northumberland magnetic signature is a lot bigger, and it's pretty much in one place. And this shows us that on the Northumberland, the ferrous material, much of the ferrous material extends beyond the current exposed features of the wreck. So it's suggesting that much of it is buried. Now, if we go from 80 meters north of the Northumberland, you can see that there's a debris trail of ferrous material all the way to the Restoration, and the Restoration is pretty much in two lumps with scatterings of guns in between. So this tells me that the Restoration wrecking process was a lot more violent than the Northumberland. The Northumberland went down and stayed in one place, and the Restoration has got battered and blown across the sands, dropping guns all over the place, and is now a very much dispersed and broken up site compared to the Northumberland. The sub-bottom data is it's just what I wanted to find out. It's enabled us to understand where the bedrock is and how much depth of sand is on top of that bedrock, but also the depth of stratigraphy on the site. So if we look at the depth contour map, the purple area, which is surrounding the Northumberland now, only has really half a meter of sand on top of the bedrock. Now, where the Northumberland is, on the wreck mound, we have between 3 and 3.5 meters depth of stratigraphy. Now, we've got heavy objects such as guns at the top of the stratigraphy. Heavy objects tend to make their way down to the seabed unless there's something stopping them get down to the bedrock, unless there's something to stop them. And I believe that's the ship or the internal parts of the ship and all of the contents. So there's huge potential with the wreck. There's 3.5 meters depth of stratigraphy. The alarming thing is behind it is only half a meter of sand. So there is insufficient burial deposits on its way, or should that sand dune move off, you're going to have 3.5 meters of archaeological material exposed. So it's a major problem about to happen, or if it hasn't already happened. To put that in perspective, here's the wreck of the Hazardous, which you would have seen Dave talk about yesterday. And when that was buried up to the breech end of one of the guns, gun 9 there, that would have had roughly 1 meter of sand on top of it. And that 1 meter of sand has been able to preserve half of the port side from roughly amidships to the bow, from the gun deck to the keel. Here is the Invincible after he excavated the bow, and again it's preserved from, this is the port bow from the gun deck down to the keel, and in just over a metre depth of stratigraphy, it has supported and preserved these three-dimensional features of the ship, including the decks, as well as all of the contents. So this is just, imagine what we're going to find in 3.5 meters depth of stratigraphy on the Northumberland. These are incredibly exciting times. The multi-beams also showed the survey of the wider area, 2 large Admiralty pattern-looking anchors to the north and east of the Northumberland and the restoration. So these, I've no doubt, these are from these sites, and just goes to show how far they dragged their anchors. And this is going to tell you the story of the wrecking. So let's move on and let me talk about some of the exposed archaeological features we're beginning to see on the site. So first of all, in 2018, Tom Harrison was diving in the northern area of the site, and he came across this really unusual assemblage. It was a very kind of spiky, needle-like features sticking out the sand. And it took us a while to understand what they were, but when you look closely at them, you can see that they're swords. And if you look at this image, the scales in this image are 1 meter scale. So this is about a 2 by 2 area of swords. When we went back in 2021, we've lost nearly 1 meter of sand now, and it revealed a much bigger assemblage of small arms, including more swords and now a stack of muskets, and they're all stuck together. Now, the master gunner on board the ship would have been in charge of storing and looking after these weapons. We know that the gunner's storeroom on most ships is in the bow on the orlop deck, but we're not in the bow, we're in the stern. So were they kept somewhere in the stern? Were they kept in the master gunner's quarters, maybe on the gun room at the stern end of the gun deck? Not sure. Were they distributed all over the ship? Again, we don't know. We know from the Sterling that they did find musket fragments on various places of the wreck. So it is a possibility that they were stored in various places. But again, these are sort of questions that we need to answer. And this just confirms that they are, or some of those concreted objects were swords. We recovered a section that had broken away. There's lots of damage by trawling nets. These were deconcreted, x-rayed at Historic England, and confirmed that you can see the leather scabbard here. The leather is in very good condition. The x-ray identified, weren't expecting this, 5 buttons in a row, which has obviously come from someone's clothing, or possibly a sailor that passed away nearby when the ship was lost. So what sort of weapons, hand weapons, would be carried on a 70-gun warship from this period? Well, we can see from this inventory that they carried swords and hangers. Now, this is back to Captain Bembo here, and I think he's holding a hanger, which is a curved bladed weapon. It's quite short, so this is ideal for using in confined spaces. You wouldn't want a sword that's too long. Now, if that's a hanger, what does a sword look like? I'm guessing here, was a sword more of a straight bladed weapon? I'm not entirely sure. Someone may know. I'm only just starting to research these. The muskets, well, you would have seen from Dave's lecture yesterday that the musket that was recovered was a flintlock, had a flintlock firing mechanism. So we've got flintlock muskets, musketoons, blunderbusses. They have the flared barrels. Then we've also got pistols. So here we've got a very significant assemblage of small arms from the Northumberland. Just forwards of these assemblage of muskets and swords, we've got a group of 3 guns. These are the biggest guns that we've seen on the site. Gun 1 and 2 are probably demi cannons, the biggest guns from the main gun deck. Gun 3 appears to be a little bit longer, possibly making it a culverin, which would be one of the chase guns. So we were meant to be in the stern area, so it isn't reasonable to suggest that this could be a culverin. And it also has part of the carriage surviving. Underneath, you can see disappearing parts of the ship, the structure of the ship. We've got difficult to tell exactly what part of the ship it is, but it shows the potential we have. There's a good area to maybe do some dendro to identify, you know, the different building sequences, where the timber came from, and also whether this could be the Northumberland or the Restoration. Another gun that we came across this year was towards the the southeast end of the site, and again it's heavily concreted, but this has a substantial part of its carriage surviving. We measured this, and it's 9.5 feet long. Now, the length doesn't tell you, isn't the best indicator for the type, because the Northumberland had 2 types of gun on board that were 9.5 feet long. That was demi-cannon, were all 9.5 feet, but 8 of the demi-culverin were also 9.5 feet. Now, the muzzle end is heavily concreted, so we can't get a very good measurement there, and the breech end has got other things concreted to it, so I can't get a reliable measurement there to see if it can give me a better idea of whether it's a demi-cannon or demi-culverin. The other clue, I think, comes from the carriage in identifying what type of gun it is. So if you look at the underside of the of the carriage on the left image, you'll see these 2 concreted iron bolts, and those are iron bolts. They're called iron through bolts that support and reinforce the cheeks of the carriage. Now, in the early 2000s, a gun with its carriage was recovered from the Stirling Castle, and this was a demi-cannon from the main gun deck, so the biggest guns. And this was published by Doug McElvoe, and he described in his publication that the carriage was constructed with 3 iron through bolts. So this is suggesting that the bigger guns needed the extra reinforcement in their carriages. Here is a carriage that was found and recorded by Ruth Brown and Kay Smith, and these pictures are courtesy of them. And it's a contemporary carriage, but it's got a demi-culverin on top, so it's a smaller carriage. And you can see that it's constructed with 2 iron through bolts. So this is just supporting what I'm suggesting, that on the seabed, on the Northumberland, what we're dealing with is one of the demi-culverins and not the demi-cannon. What other things can we identify from this very concreted gun and carriage? Well, we can see how the gun is situated in its carriage and how it would have been housed on the deck, on the gun deck. So during bad weather, they would have wanted to close all of the gun ports, even on the upper deck. To do that, you need to run the gun in and either elevate the muzzle of the gun and fasten it, lash it above the port, or if there isn't enough space, generally at the forward end of the ship, you would then have the gun facing either forward or astern and lash it horizontally across the port. We can clearly see on the Northumberland example that the muzzle is elevated, so suggesting that it was running and lashed to the top of the gun port. And this is again supported from the wreck of the Stirling Castle, from the demi-cannon that was recovered. You can see that the muzzle is clearly elevated, and when Doug deconcreted it, it had the muzzle lashings around the muzzle end. So another big feature, interesting feature, is this huge concretion towards the southeast end of the site, and it's very difficult to understand what it is. It's covered in fishing net as well, all sorts of fishing net, but it's a huge conglomerate. You've got copper vessels, you've got lead scuppers, you've got staved buckets and barrels, you've got ceramic pots in there. You can see the structure of the ship underneath, going in underneath it. You can see if you're looking towards the north, you can see groups of pulley sheaves. Here you can see I'm sort of illuminating a group of sheaves. So this is obviously near a store for spare rigging blocks. So I think what this large concretion was, it was part of the shot locker, and as the ship is broken up, other parts have got attached to it, and all the iron leaching out is formed concretion over these other objects. You can see that some of it is obviously, you can see the shots. So we've got a mixture of bar shot and round shot here, but we can also see other just sort of bars of iron. And I wondered, was this part of, you know, fastening the ship structure? But then I started looking closely at, it's just to highlight where those bars are. Looking at the, you know, ordnance stores on a 70-gun ship, and the projectiles, and you can see round shot is obviously the projectile choice for smashing through ships' hulls. And then you've got these hammered double-headed shot. That is your wrought iron bar shot that Dave showed you. So these examples are from Hazardous, and they're, when the wrought iron is red hot, they hammer each end into a shape and size to fit the appropriate gun. Wrought iron is a lot more malleable and effective than cast iron. Cast iron bar shot is brittle and will break on impact. Wrought iron is strong enough to go through the ship, smash knees, beams, go through iron bolts, take down masts. It was obviously preferred, because if you look at this list, there isn't a number behind the cast variety. But we also see quite a large number of bars of iron, 350 here. So a significant amount of the projectiles on board for these bars of iron. And a contemporary ordnance specialist, Captain Povey, describes these iron bars 18 to 20 inches in length, and they would have wrapped 2 or 3 of them together with rope and you know, wadding at either end. So when it goes out, fired through the gun, it doesn't, you know, damage the inside of the barrel. And these were very effective at taking out rigging and also clearing the deck. So good anti-personnel projectile. Now, it isn't just, you know, big objects that are emerging. We are starting to see the more, you know, vulnerable items. And here we've got an amazing, this is like a time capsule within a time capsule. Here you've got a chest emerging from the sand, and who doesn't get excited about finding a chest? This one, I mean, these type of things don't survive on a kind of scattered and dispersed site. You get this where you've got, you know, generally 3-dimensional structures still surviving, crap sediments that preserve these objects. So this is extremely exciting. You've got a clothes find here, no idea what's inside it, but this is an object that, you know, is vulnerable. We're starting to see more of these copper vessels, and we recovered similar ones from the wreck of the Hazardous 2 seasons ago, and you would have seen those. They're almost exactly the same. These have probably come from the ship's galley. We're starting to see all this fragile rope that Bob first identified in the 1990s. Now, it was very difficult to, one of the other challenges, I mean, the challenges you have on the Goodwins is, you know, the visibility, you know, generally is pretty poor. You've got the movement of the sands constantly changing the appearance of the site. But when the exposed remains are exposed for a prolonged period of time, they start getting covered in mussels, and this disguises, it camouflages everything. And it was only when you remove sections mussels that you begin to see what's underneath. And here I started to see that it was all of this rope, all this fragile organic remains, and it just, again, is showing the potential this site has. And we're getting more fragile finds, such as onion bottles. Now, all of these things are now vulnerable to not only the physical and biological environment, but also to, you know, any opportunists, divers who may want to have a dive on the site when they shouldn't be. There's no longer a presence on the Goodwins because Bob has given up diving. There's no diving boats going out of Ramsgate. There's only one in Dover, so it's very difficult to get out site regularly. So there's a lot going against the site at the moment. It's not just the physical environment and the movement of the sands, but it's an extremely exciting time to be involved in this wreck. So what is the future for the Northumberland? Well, for me, as I said, these are extremely exciting times to be involved in this wreck site. The site has got huge archaeological potential. the work that Historic England has done to you know, the funding they've provided, the monitoring has identified that the site is at risk and the sandbanks are moving away from the wreck, and this looks like this trend is going to continue. The sub-bottom data has identified a depth of stratigraphy of 3.5 meters, and the archaeology is showing that there is archaeology emerging from all layers within that. So it's got huge archaeological potential. The alarming part is there isn't the depth of stratigraphy, you know, behind the wreck. You know, as soon as that, you know, if it hasn't already done, that subaqueous dune is gone now and it's moved on. There isn't the depth of sand behind to, you know, to support the preservation of this wreck. So to make all of this work meaningful, we've now got to progress and think about planning strategic threat and research-led excavation. Now, I'm realistic. You can't excavate the whole site, but I think we've got to start looking at you know, specific areas, target specific areas of the ship, and have specific to answer specific research questions. So we've got to start planning now. We can't wait for 2 years' time, 3 years' time. It's, you know, this is the time to do it. This is the opportunity. In the meantime, while we're doing this planning, we've got to continue with the monitoring, because the site is changing so quickly. We've got to continue diving so we can identify the features that are exposing all of the time. So yeah, I just want to finish by saying this is a very exciting time to be involved in the wreck, and I just want to say a huge thanks to Historic England who have been supporting my research and funding this work, and also all the team members involved in the diving, the geophysics, including MSCS Marine has been supported all of that work. And also we've got the Goodwin Sands Conservation Trust, Ashore, who's trying to promote the Goodwins and also the site as well. And I can't forget Bob Peacock and Sea Dive, who have you know, done so much for the Northumberland and all of the other wrecks. And also I just want to say thanks to Bournemouth University, who I'm also worked for and have supplied, you know, kit and personnel. And also just want to say thanks to Mark Beattie and everyone at NAS for organising such a brilliant conference, and to all of the other speakers who have, you know, done such a great job. It's not easy doing it virtually, and I hope next time I can see you all in the flesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Brilliant as always, and perfect timing there. 16:43. Do you want to turn your camera on? We can see you at home. There you go. You have your stopwatch visible. You know you were perfect on the timing.
I know, I was keeping an eye on it.
We do have questions, so if you're able to, you can probably see them for yourself actually in Zoom on the Q&A. I can read them out for others. So Jack Pink, it's quite a long question, or that's almost two questions in fact. From your investigations of the ship, have you been able to gain some idea of how the ship fits into 17th to 18th century transition? Do you think it's a candidate to try and establish the wider network of the ship and see how these show changes at the turn of the century, etc.? That's almost two questions.
This is a very good point, and the answer is, well, just from the surface, it's very difficult to identify any detail like that. So this is why we need to do excavation. And, you know, it's important that the Northumberland isn't important on its own. It's important as of a collection of Royal Navy ships. So if we want to understand the changes in maritime culture, the developments in technology, we need to investigate these shipwrecks as a collective. So comparing it with the work on the London, comparing it with the Hazardous, comparing it with the Invincible. And I think by working on Northumberland, it's going to make the work on those sites even more important, because we can share all of this information and see how things changed and developed over time. But at the moment, everything is either covered in marine growth or we're just seeing surfaces that are riddled in gribble and teredo. To to see the finer details that are going to tell us, these, are going to supply the connection between the people on board. We need to excavate it. You need to get to those well preserved layers. So that's the future. That's what we need to do.
It's their group value, I think HE would call it, or wouldn't they, in terms of the collection as a whole. Is the coronation part of that 1677 shipbuilding program too?
That's a good question. I think it might be. Yeah, I think it's one of the second rates.
Yeah, because that was at the Battle of Beachy Head in 1690 as well, before it then was lost in 1691. Leon asked the question I was going to ask, but so we'll ask it from Leon. The chest, I mean, it's quite exciting to see something just emerging from the sands, possibly for the first time. That's a wooden chest, presumably.
I presume so, but it's very close to the big concretion that I was talking about. So all the iron is leached out and concreted it. But I mean, that's good because, if you
protective layer.
Yes, protect it. So that is completely a sealed time capsule that I have no doubt is, whatever is in it is going to be interesting.
In terms of the size compared to what you've seen on Invincible, is it as big, small? Because
I think it's roughly about 0.5 meter long, by probably 250 wide. Yeah, I mean, we found a similar chest on the Invincible, which ended up being full of musket shot. So
not very exciting.
That wasn't well. It was really well. It's not exciting as it could have been, but there's huge potential for more of these things. I doubt this is the only one.
Yeah, it wasn't perhaps what you wished for when you opened the chest to go, right, okay.
No, so maybe my luck's changed with this if we ever get the chance to recover it.
Maybe. Joe Thompson from the Goodwin Sands Conservation Trust says, is the sand moving away from the wreck to the north or to the south from your multi-beam? Yeah,
so it's moving to the northeast. So, well, the main sandbanks looks like it's going eastwards, but the kind of those sub-Aquarius dunes are moving in a northeastwards direction. So you've got kind of different layers on the Goodwins. You've got sand waves on top of sand dunes, and they all move in they're all affected by tide and current, but they're all moving in a generally, well, they're all moving away from the wreck in an eastwards direction. But the tide is going. You can see which way the tide's going by just the direction of how the sand is being blown off the wreck.
And of course, the restoration, if it is the restoration, has now been added to the Heritage at Risk register, hasn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, the work that we've been doing over the 4 years has demonstrated, has been monitoring the restoration as well. I mean, the Northumberland and the restoration are so close to one another that you have to
treat as one. Really,
you treat them as one site, really. And I mean, the monitoring has demonstrated just how dynamic the sands are and the importance of doing regular surveys. And really, you just can't just stop until, you may want to stop when the site is completely buried again. It's like the Stirling Castle, which is about 1.5 kilometers further north. The sandbank is going westwards, and that's completely covered the Stirling now. So,
which in many ways is the good thing, isn't it? That's what you kind of, in terms of it being protected until there are hopefully resources and people to deal with situations.
Yes.
Maybe.
Well, I'm glad I'm the licensee of the Northumberland and not the Stirling, though.
Well, at this moment in time, yes. Is there any, going back to the story of the Great Storm and the survivors, I mean, the one single one, that's a lucky person, isn't it, to survive from the Mary, and then the others that survived. There in the archives, then there's their witness testimony, eyewitness accounts of how the ships went down, how fast or slow.
There are, and many of them come from the logs from the other ships that survived the storm. Some ships remained at anchor, and others were fortunate enough just to get blown over the sands and out to sea, and ended up places, to Holland. It was blowing that You know, I think some of them ended up in Norway. But yeah, so there are accounts of obviously what was happening, and then obviously during the night you can't really see much, but they describe during the day, you know, how, you know, the Northumberland and Restoration and Mary were missing. And I think they described that you could still see the Sterling was above water with some of the survivors, and one of the survivor from the Mary was actually, I think, swept off the deck of the Mary and swept onto the deck of the Sterling. So if that's true, how lucky is that?
Oh yeah.
And then he was rescued from the Sterling.
Wow. Someone had a lucky day.
Exactly. So yeah, no, there's some incredible stories, and I have to put my hands up. I haven't fully researched those accounts. I mean, I'm focused at the moment on the archaeology, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of potential there to investigate, you know, the logs of these ships and the first-hand accounts.
And not forget, focused on writing a PhD, Dan.
Well, that's now doing the Viva now.
Oh,
Tuesday.
On Tuesday. Well, very, very best luck. We have a comment from Steve Ellis, but it's not, you know, as expected, and from my experience of working with the London, about how, you know, these sites becoming eroding out and material coming to the surface, and the resources that are required, and the struggle to try to pick what to do, what to work on. It's not a question, it's just a comment. Okay, so folks, it is now 10:02. Dan, thanks so much for wrapping it up. We really did want to finish with another nice protected wreck, nice nautical bit of archaeology there, and with the connection to the IJNA. The papers, as Dan alluded to, are open access, available on the IJNA site with Taylor and Francis, or if you are a member and subscribe to the journal, of course, you can go through the membership portal to access that content. We look forward to hearing more about it in the future years, Dan. And yeah, good luck with the Viva.